right, good morning, everyone. I can't say that I came from any of those far destinations that were just mentioned. I actually just live 2 minutes down the street, so I enjoyed coming here this morning. I'm happy to see lots of new faces in the audience and a few that I recognize as well from participation in our research center. And today we're going to try and talk about some of the things that we may not necessarily be aware of that could be the underlying mechanisms of disease. And what we do at our center is try to identify these things with the hope of trying to figure out if these things are really underlying mechanisms, could we eventually develop new therapies as a result. Okay, so we're going to jump right into it. We're going to start very simply with a basic question. Could Parkinson's disease be considered a form of accelerated aging? You could think about this for yourself. You could think about the motor symptoms that we have in Parkinson's: slower movement, stiffness, sometimes shaking of the hands, postural control, balance issues, walking deficits. And you could picture somebody 90 years old and say, well, isn't that all of us? We could also think about the cognitive decline, memory, confusion, hallucinations, dementia. All of these things could also be mistaken for old age. Autonomic function issues, bladder control, constipation, sexual dysfunction, cardiovascular issues. All of these things are things that happen with old age. So we could easily ask the question right now, is it possible that a 60-year-old Parkinson's patient is the same as a 90-year-old? We have to keep that in the back of our mind. And sometimes one of these things that we need to ask is, could this be related to the fact that as you get older, you just simply become physically inactive? So it's kind of a chicken and egg question, and this has led us to look at this in a little bit more detail with the idea that you can see these two vicious circles here. You've got the one circle, which is Parkinson's disease and the symptoms that start to develop over time. And at the same time, we have cardiometabolic disease on the other side, which with decreased physical activity, you start to develop this other circle as well. So it's important to think about it from that perspective. And when we do that, of course, we have to think about the treatments to start. Most of you probably know that dopamine is the treatment of choice. Dopamine replacement is the most common and gold standard treatment for Parkinson's. But we have some limitations with these medications. We know that sometimes they wear off with prolonged use. We know that we have something called motor fluctuations, which means that sometimes the medications work really well, and then in other cases they just don't seem to work at all. And in other cases we have issues like dyskinesia, where the medications seem to give too much of a movement emphasis, and then you end up with these extra movements of your body. So of course there are alternatives to these. There's things like dopamine agonists, things that you might commonly recognize as Requip or Mirapex. And those drugs are not as effective, and they've also been associated with addictive and compulsive behaviors. Some of them have been taken off the market already because they've been associated with valve dysfunction of the heart. And both of these strategies have this issue of potentially leading to cognitive dysfunction and side effects like things like hypotension and overall poor blood pressure control, which is important to consider because, of course, sometimes we run into patients that will say, gosh, my symptoms are getting worse, and the usual answer is, well, that means that we need to up your medications, but if the medications cause this blood pressure problem, you could end up falling more as a result of increasing your meds. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to play doctor with me now. I'm going to play a little video, and I want you to think about, if we're trying to find underlying mechanisms, I want you to think about what really could be the cause of this man's symptoms. This is a pretty popular video, but let's, oops. There we go. Okay, so take a look at the things that you can see here. Tremor is pretty obvious. If you notice, the young assistant there is trying to get this man to step forward by putting her foot there as a target. He's got very, very small steps. His head is kind of leaning forward into this, what we call a stooped posture. And he seems to get stuck every once in a while until his feet bring him down to the ground. Okay, notice that the tremor stopped, by the way, at the end. Okay, so with that in mind, and I'm going to bring up a perspective that may actually be somewhat dated, but at the same time, it's an important perspective to consider. This was originally written by Latache and Anson. Mark Latache is from Pennsylvania, and Greg Anson is down south in Australia, New Zealand area, and they asked the question, well, what is typical about atypical populations? What do we call normal and what don't we call normal? And just because we have a symptom, as we call it, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing, or is there a reason why that symptom actually exists? So we could ask the question to start with, why do we shake? I actually want you to participate in this. I'm not going to stand up here and just lecture to you. Why do we shake in general? If you're tired, Rose sometimes stays up too late, and after a long night of drinking too much coffee, then her hands might get shaky. When else do we get shaky? When you're excited, when you're nervous. We often ask our patients, if you're standing up in front of an audience, what happens to your hands? And they say, yeah, for some reason my hands start to shake more. Okay, so anxiety, nervousness, scared, tiredness, those could all be factors. Evolutionary-wise, if we think about this, there may be a reason for this. Maybe we need to increase our alertness. Maybe we want to be able to sense what's in our surroundings in case we're worried about bumping into something. So these researchers, Latache and Anson, would say, maybe it's not so atypical. Maybe this is the response that's necessary because something in our brain isn't working properly. Let's think about another symptom. When do we stiffen up and walk slow? Again, when we're nervous, yes. When else? Think of the last time that you've, yep. Uneven terrain, I was going to mention ice. Of course, winter is very shortly coming. And when we walk across a patch of ice, what do? Hands out at our sides, smaller steps to make sure that we're stable, correct? So if we think about this again from an evolutionary perspective, perhaps the increased tone that we have increases our sensitivity so that we can respond better in a situation of danger if we're lacking that postural stability. The third one is stooped posture. And by stooped posture, I mean the leaning forward as a person is walking. Can you think of any time that you choose to lean forward when you walk? Any good? Yes? What did you say up here? When he's looking for money, you're actually on the right track. Walking into the wind, so to protect your eyes as well, okay? So if things are blowing, you want to keep your head down? Yeah? Walking uphill, that's an interesting one. Why would you look down when you're walking up a hill? Oh, so that you're worried about going higher and you're worried about how high the hill is? Okay, actually, so you may not have heard that, but she said, actually, if there's twigs and things on the ground, I want to make sure that I can see them so that if I'm hiking, I don't trip over anything. And actually, that was the response I was looking for. So I'm glad I asked you to elaborate. If you think about it, as an adaptation, a stooped posture forces us to put our head down so that our eyes can actually take a look at our surroundings in a much better way. So from an evolutionary perspective, again, it may seem very logical that in fact, in Parkinson's, we've chosen to do this so that we've got better view of the ground that we're stepping on. Great job. Okay, so where are we going with this? This is a very simple diagram, and this is kind of going to outline the rest of my talk. The idea here is that we have this giant blue thing here called gray matter. It's the fluffy stuff on the top of our brain. And it basically does all this type of processing. It processes perception and proprioception, it processes anxiety, and cognitive issues, sort of problem-solving type things that we do on a regular basis. But what I want to point out to you is that these colors down below, the pink and the yellow and the green and the blue, those are supposed to represent the basal ganglia nuclei. That's the part of the brain that actually degenerates in Parkinson's. And a copy of all the information that our cortex processes goes through the basal ganglia. What I want you to think about as I'm talking about the studies that I'm going to tell you about today is the potential idea that if there's too much information filling this funnel, then the funnel may overflow. And if it can't handle the amount of information, we essentially have to put the brakes on so that we can make better sense of what we're doing. So maybe the adaptation is tilting our head forward, maybe it's stiffening our posture and keeping our hands at our side without an arm swing, so that we can better deal with what's coming up in our environment. Okay, so of the three things, I'm going to start over here, and we're going to talk about perception and proprioception and how that might play a role in overloading our basal ganglia system. This is a very simple experiment that we did, and some of you may recognize this slide. I've talked about this study before at a previous conference for this group. The basic idea of trying to look at where a target is, so imagine it's the speaker that I'm trying to walk to. In this experiment, I could ask one of you to show me with a laser pointer and show me where you think that speaker is if I shut off all the lights on you. In this condition, I could put you in a wheelchair, and I could say, take a look at where the speaker is. I shut off all the lights on you, and then I start wheeling you and say, tell me when to stop, when you think you're actually at the speaker. And the third condition, the one in the middle, of course, is the easiest one to think about. You see the speaker, I shut off the lights on you, and I ask you to walk until you think you're actually at the speaker. And what we're looking at here, the black bars represent healthy control participants. The gray bars are Parkinson's patients on their meds, and the white bars are Parkinson's patients when they're off their meds, and it's the same patients actually both on and off. And what you can see is that distance estimation, when you're just pointing to the target and trying to remember where it was, is slightly impaired in the Parkinson's patients compared to the healthy people. This is a scale of error. So the higher up on the scale you are, the worse your memory of where that location was. So what you can see is that the laser condition, the Parkinson's patients are worse compared to the healthy controls. If we put people in a wheelchair, you can see that in all three groups the error goes up, but really the Parkinson's patients are doing much worse. And then the most important part in terms of our statistics and what's a statistical difference between Parkinson's patients and healthy controls is this difference here. So these are the people off their meds, the Parkinson's patients off their meds, and the healthy controls. And notice that it's only in the walk condition, and that's what this little star is supposed to signify, it's only in the walk condition that the Parkinson's patients become significantly worse than the healthy controls, hinting to the fact that probably when we're walking, the ability to sense what our legs are telling us about how we're moving through our environment must be impaired. This may be one reason why we evolved to say, I need vision to look down at the ground and make sure I can sense where I'm going because my legs aren't telling me anymore. Okay, we could take this a step further, and I know that some of you have participated in these experiments. So imagine having virtual reality goggles on your face, and you're imagining that you're trying to walk down this carpet, and I basically plop a red dot in the middle of this carpet, and I say, try and walk that distance. What we did in this experiment, and the reason that we had virtual reality to allow us to do this, is that we changed the speed of how things are moving past you in your environment. So you can imagine how you see trees and sidewalks and everything pass you as you're driving. In this case, what we did is we either slowed down what the people were seeing as they were walking towards that target. Baseline would be their normal self-paced speed of visual information going past them. And this is what happens when we speed everything up. The logic here, of course, is that we thought that if we slowed down the visual information, we thought that the Parkinson's patients might actually do just as well as the healthy people. Surprisingly, in the baseline condition, here's the Parkinson's patients off their meds again. Here's Parkinson's patients on their meds. If you compare their error to the healthy people, you can see that they're quite errorful. In fact, they're having difficulty trying to make sense of their own self-paced movement speed. But even when we slow down the visual information, thinking that that was going to help them, notice that the bars look basically the same. So the difference between slow and baseline is essentially the same. In fact, the only difference here is really that the healthy people don't like being slowed down in that visual feedback. What's most important to notice, though, is this fast condition. The fast condition shows us that the Parkinson's patients get significantly worse in both the on state and even worse in the off state if we speed up what they're seeing as the world is passing them by. Which means that really the brain must be needing more time to try and process what we're doing, and that's probably a very good reason why we have some of the slowness in Parkinson's. In other words, if there's too much information going into the funnel, then of course we have to say, slow down, I need to make sense of this, and when I can, then I'm going to be able to continue. And so that's my conclusion for this experiment. The visual processing speed dramatically influences depth perception in Parkinson's disease, especially when you're not optimally medicated. There is one other thing I wanted to do today, and I thought I'd just mention it now. I'm here as the spokesperson, essentially, for our center, but really this work is all done by some fantastic students at our Movement Disorders Research Center. And as you heard in the introduction, I want to make sure that the students are acknowledged for the work and the funding sources are. So this is Kaylena Eggets-Martins. She's now at the University of Sydney doing a postdoctoral degree. She won 2 times over the Canada Brain Star Award for this research, and her entire PhD with us was funded by the Canadian Institute for Health Research. Let me show you another experiment, and some of you may recognize this as well from having participated in this. We had walls, and you can see in this one situation here, we asked people to walk through these walls that are basically narrowing, with the idea that maybe if you're feeling like you're starting to move into a narrow space, that something's going to happen to your ability to be able to walk. And in this other case, you can see that the opening at the end is still the same distance, still 70 centimeters on both sides. But in this case, the walls are parallel. So you're basically walking through a tight space the entire way through. And this one showed us, there's 2 things. We asked people to judge with their hands, show me how big you think the space is at the end of the tunnel, to see if there was any difference between this case and this case. Some of you may recognize the term Mueller-Lyer illusion, which basically means that when you see things moving towards a narrow end, you underestimate or think that space at the end is actually smaller, and we wanted to know if that was an issue in Parkinson's. And not surprisingly, it was. So if we asked people in this condition, what's the size of the door, they would actually put their hands up like this and say, oh, it's tiny, I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to make it through. Whereas even though this is the same size opening, they would actually rate it as bigger because they could see that right from the start of the tunnel. However, when we asked them to walk through these passageways, and these were people that suffer from freezing of gait, where their feet actually get stuck when they're walking, it was actually this condition that caused the most freezing, the one with the very narrow corridor all the way through. Not surprisingly, though, we did end up finding that our patients increased in their tremor at the same time. So remember, we were talking about why do we tremor? In a tight space where we feel confined and we're worried about hitting the walls and banging into them, perhaps this is a way of trying to increase our sensory ability to figure out where we are in space. Okay, so I'll skip over that one. So that takes care of our first bubble. There's a couple of examples there that shows you why perception of space, and proprioception is a fancy word for sensing the information that your legs and arms are telling you while you're moving, If that information overloads the basal ganglia, then perhaps we can't make sense of that information very well. The second thing we're going to talk about is cognitive and executive function. This is work by another PhD student, and basically what he wanted to try and understand is what happens when your feet are walking up to an obstacle. So this is a bird's eye view of what these people would be doing. So imagine you start walking from back here, you walk, and then eventually you have to step over some obstacle that's in the travel path, and then of course you take your 2 final steps to make sure that you're stable. And in this study, the trick to this experiment was that, yes, of course, we want to make sure that they're able to clear over the obstacle without tripping. But at the same time, we wanted to know, well, what happens if we try and distract someone? So this is comparable to you trying to use your cell phone while you're driving. Hopefully none of you do that as much as I do. I know you do. Okay. So the idea here is that we measured the speed of their walking, and you can see we broke their walking into the early phase of walking, the late phase, meaning just before they get to the obstacle, and what you're seeing on the left side here is what happens when you don't have that secondary task to do, and really the secondary task was a string of numbers that you had to listen to. And you had to tell us if you heard certain numbers as the person was walking. And then in the second situation here, what you can see is the patients and healthy controls. When you hear the numbers, and you're supposed to tell me in a string of numbers sounding like this, 5, 7, 9, 3, 1, tell me how many times you heard the number 1. So you have to listen for one specific number. So what you can see here is that, of course, the Parkinson's patients, and this is Parkinson's patients off their meds, as they get closer to an obstacle, so this is the late phase of walking, they actually slow down. That's not all that surprising. In fact, everybody slows down. It's just that the Parkinson's patients off their meds slow down more. We also looked at the shuffling or variability in the steps, and you can see that really the shuffling and variability in the steps doesn't really change if we compare healthy people to Parkinson's patients. Where things get interesting is when we add the secondary dual task of the holding your cell phone, if you will. And what you can see here is that with the velocity, you see basically the same effect with the Parkinson's patients, that the Parkinson's patients are slowing down as they get closer to the obstacle. But here's where things get interesting, because here you can see that the Parkinson's patients, regardless of whether they're on or off their meds, their steps start to become much, much more variable, which means that there's more shuffling, there's more changes in speed, there's more uncertainty about whether or not they're going to be able to clear the obstacle. And that's a pretty important concern, because that means that maybe when you have this other cognitive task to worry about, you're unable to make sense of where your legs are in space, and your likelihood of tripping over the obstacle becomes worse. So cognitive overload from distraction can lead to increased trips and falls in Parkinson's. This work would have been done by Federico Pieruccini Faria. He won the Laurier Gold Medal of Excellence just last year, as well as the Governor General of Canada Award for his thesis research. And he was funded by the Brazilian Science and Technology Foundation to come here and study in Canada. Okay, I'm not sure if this person is in the room, but we're going to show this other video. This is another dual task type condition, but this is looking at freezers now, people who get stuck while they're walking. And so what I'm going to show you, although you can't hear the sound on this, is a person who's walking, and you can see that they're basically walking to a door. You can see the door frame that he's headed towards, and this is a frontal view of the same thing. And he's listening to a string of numbers. And as he listens to that string of numbers, notice that his feet, here's his feet getting tracked here, he gets stuck. I haven't paused the video, it's still actually playing. He's stuck, and you can see his balance is going back and forth by the little red dot that's tracking his balance here. He's still trying to figure out how to get the steps forward. And eventually he will do it. The video is still playing, there you go. He manages to get his way back to walking, and then of course when he gets to the doorway causes him to freeze even more. Notice now in this second condition, I'm going to show you, oh, I can see it's still freezing there. Okay, so notice in the second condition, we've just put some very simple lines on the ground. There's no numbers to listen to in the background as a distraction task. And watch the same man's performance. Oops. Look at the size of those steps, as if he doesn't have a care in the world. Very fast progression. He gets all the way to the doorway, but then, of course, right at the doorway itself, he ends up freezing. So what we wanted to know in this experiment was, well, what happens if we put these two things together? We know that the visual cues, remember we said that if we turn the head down, it might be to collect visual information. So in this case, when he looks at the lines, he improves his ability to walk. We wanted to know, well, what happens if we put those visual cue lines there and we play the dual task at the same time? Are we going to cause some sort of overload that he's going to freeze? Or are the visual cues going to win out and he'll basically be able to walk? And so this is the third example. What do you think it looks more like? The good performance or the bad performance? How many would say good? Hands up. Okay. How many would say bad? More like the first one? Oh, we got almost a 50-50 split. Yeah, unfortunately, that's what the reviewer said to me as well when I was trying to get this published. He said, that's not convincing of anything. So we did one more thing because we weren't sure ourselves which was really winning out and what's the real explanation here. So in this last video, I'm going to try and point this. See, my hand is pointing to this little thing. This is what I call a Canadian Tire experiment. We had a little platform and we attached it to his chest. And the idea of the platform, I have a pretty loud voice, so I'm going to yell from here. The idea of a platform is that if the platform is out like this, then you can't actually see your feet. So if vision can't help you see your feet, and the only thing you have to help see, make sense of where your legs are in space is that proprioception that we talked about before. The sense that we know that our legs are moving, even though our eyes aren't telling us that our legs are moving. We wanted to see if the information from these visual cues would still help. You couldn't hear in the back there? Okay, so there was a platform that we had across their chest so that they couldn't see their feet. So the idea here is that you can see the visual lines coming ahead. So if you're planning ahead with vision, you should still be fine. And if vision is really trying to help make up for what your legs aren't telling you, then of course you're going to suffer, just like the dual task condition when you're listening to numbers. Now you can tell me which one this video looks more like. Notice that this, and yes, it's still playing. This is the earliest that this man freezes. And in fact, the freezing occurs several times over the path, and I'm sure you would agree with me now that when you can't see your feet, that really it's almost as bad as having that dual task of listening to the string of numbers on the phone, which tells you that vision must be trying to compensate for the fact that our legs can't actually sense where we're going in space anymore, and maybe that's one of the reasons that we slow down in Parkinson's. Okay. One more study on this topic. I wanted to show this because this is something fairly recent, and in fact, this just came out last month. We were testing people's balance. Attention is part of cognition, and we would have put them in a harness like this. Some people will say that these are cruel experiments, but they're very important. We put people in harnesses, we ask them to lean forward, and as they're leaning forward, we let go of the harness so that they fall forward. And the idea here was to try and understand if we tell them to focus internally on what your body feels like. I know people are smiling at me saying, I would never do this. This is why the big crane was over top, to make sure that nobody fell, and nobody did. We asked people to focus on what their body is telling them about are they falling forward, or we asked them to watch for a dot on the ground and see if they were getting closer to that dot. If you focus on the dot, which is what we call an external focus of attention, you end up doing a lot better balance-wise in terms of making a response than trying to sense what your body is telling you about whether or not you're falling. So again, this idea of sensing what your body is telling you, especially when it comes to what we tell you to attend to as a cognitive function, becomes very important. All right, and this is Eric Beck. Eric Beck just won last weekend the 2016 Gold Medal of Academic Excellence. And I should just tell you that he ended up taking the study a little bit further, and he applied the external and internal focus of attention to our PD SafeX rehab program, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And this work was funded by the Ontario government. Okay, so we've covered two strands here. We've covered this and the idea of perception and proprioception overloading the basal ganglia. We've covered the cognitive and executive function and the idea of attention potentially overloading the basal ganglia. The third one is the limbic system and the anxiety system, with the idea that perhaps in all of our examples that we started with, we're basically scared. This is another experiment that we had difficulty getting past through ethics. We asked people to try and actually initially, I should tell you just off the start, we asked people initially to walk across a plank. The university said, "Are you kidding? Somebody's bound to fall and you will lose your job." So we did not get ethics approval for that study. And instead we used virtual reality. And in virtual reality, I could do the same thing. I could tell you, look, all I want you to do is walk across this piece of carpet that's on this flat surface floor until you make it to the square, okay? At the same time, and this is condition, these are different conditions. So this is condition A, just walk across the ground until you can see that you make it to the square. In condition C down here, we give them virtual feet so that you can actually see your own legs moving as you're walking through this virtual environment until you've successfully made it across. Here's where things get a little bit cruel. Then I make this ground sink 500 feet down below them. It's fake. It's like a video game. I got this past ethics. And I said, look, all I want you to do is walk across the plank. And in many cases, we would have to take the goggles off and try and convince people, you know this is flat ground, you're not going to fall no matter what. And then we'd put the goggles back on, and immediately they would start shaking and panicking that they're not going to be able to get across the plank. And so, of course, here, we make them feel like they're going to fall, but we allow them vision of their feet. I'm not going to go through the whole graphs about this, but the idea behind this study is to show you that anxiety could actually overload the system as well. And if you're too fearful and you're too scared, then your ability to sense where your legs are in space to be able to walk across a plank actually suffers quite tremendously. And this is even more the case when you're off your dopamine meds or when your meds aren't working very well. So this is important to think about when we're thinking about freezing of gait and your balance control. Right, and so Kaylena, who I talked about before, this was last year awarded the North American Outstanding Student Paper Award for this research. Okay, so we've covered all three things here. We've got anxiety overloading, we've got perception and proprioception that may not be getting processed very well, and we've got cognitive function. So what that should tell us at this point, this is kind of my segue onto the rehab side, is that there must be some sorts of interactions between the cognitive systems, the sensory systems, sensory perceptual systems, and the anxiety systems. Clearly, the Parkinson's patients are slower to make visual judgments. They have some issues with depth perception and distance estimation, and it's especially compounded when we are dependent on sensory feedback from our legs, which we call proprioception. And then, of course, anxiety overloads our ability to process sensory information as well. So in the rest of our research, we've been trying to better understand now how are the resources that are being allocated for these different things, the anxiety, the sensory information from the legs, etc., how are those things influencing our overability to perform a movement? Okay, so segue. Michael J. Fox initiated this conference in 2005, and I was sitting there at the time being prepared to talk, and there were lots of people in the room that day, and he looked at me and said, well, he was probably talking to the entire audience, but unfortunately he looked right at me when he said this. And scientists too have been busy in their labs. I did a search on PubMed, and there were over 15,000 citations about Parkinson's over the last 7 years. 7 years is referring to when he had first started his Michael J. Fox Foundation. And then this is when he looked at me. He put his hand on his tie and he said, "But I'm not tying my tie any faster." And I will tell you, it was a stab in the heart that day, because basically what he's saying is the amount of research and time I waste on anxiety and balance and all these things, it's not changing his ability to walk. So we very quickly at our center decided that anything that we discover about underlying mechanisms is going to be translated into some sort of exercise rehab program. So, talking about exercise, this is the same man that you saw at the very beginning of the presentation. Whoops, this thing still doesn't like to go. Remember this man from the beginning of the presentation? Here he is again outside in the parking lot. So you might think that somebody who's incapable of taking 1 or 2 steps wouldn't be able to ride a bike, but this will surely convince you otherwise. In fact, at this point, we're concerned that he's going to run right into the main street and get run over. Luckily, he does know how to turn around, and as you can see, it's not a balance impairment. He manages to get all the way back up the street, and notice he'll even lift himself off the seat to come back up the hill. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Keep in mind, in Amsterdam, this is the #1 form of transportation. And then hops off the bike, but he's back to frozen. So this is where we come to exercise. This is our gym at the MDRC. Is there evidence for this? Yes, there is, and I'm going to go through this a little bit faster so that if we have time for questions, I can deal with them. This slide is supposed to tell you that evidence basically starts in animal models. If we induce Parkinson's disease in a rat through chemicals, we can put them on a treadmill. I often show this picture because basically at the bottom of this sloping treadmill that these rats are running on, there's basically a little electrode thing that zaps their butt if they fall down the treadmill. So every time they come to the bottom, they get zapped and they have to run all the way back up. And these studies show you that these rats, if they're forced to exercise, they end up recovering in some ways. You see increased dopamine levels, increased brain plasticity. But let's get to humans. And this is kind of switching hats. You heard in the introduction that for up until next year, my job's almost over. I'm part of this committee that looks at all different diseases and what are the appropriate exercise recommendations that should be approved across the world. And so there's things like diabetes and heart disease, and my job is to do the Parkinson's side of this for the International Committee. And I'll try and go through this fast because all these details aren't really necessary, but our task is to basically look through all randomized control trials. That means trials where subjects are randomly assigned to groups of exercise, make sure that they're actually controlled, properly designed, and we examine those studies to see if there is enough evidence to warrant trying to put something forward as an exercise recommendation. We rank these things, so here's one scale that we use as levels 1 through 4, where the top level would of course be level 1, the poorest level would be inadequate or no data in the population of interest, which would be Parkinson's for me, so we hopefully don't want to see any level 4 studies. We also rate this on a scale of grade A being the strongest recommendation, whereas grade C is the weakest recommendation. And we also rate this on a gold, silver, bronze, and platinum. Platinum is for systematic review, so I'm going to ignore that category altogether, but obviously gold must be the best. So, this is where I started to need glasses. We reviewed 3,539 citations for exercise over the last 20 years. We removed duplicates and went through this process of making sure that the things were properly designed. And by the end of it, we ended up with only 54 articles that were worthy of full review. Of those trials, I'll just tell you that 28 of them seem to be appropriate randomized control trials with interventions that were randomized with the pre and post design where you're assessing people before and after that exercise program. We can see a range of disease severity in the trials. So some trials would have had only mild Parkinson's involved. 4% would have had only moderate involved. 75% would have had a nice range, which is sometimes important. So that sort of thing. And then what I want to get to, and this is kind of the disappointing news when it comes to exercise, keep in mind that the 1A gold level is where we're hoping to see studies, because that's going to be the solid recommendation that means this is something that we definitely recommend. Unfortunately, there are no studies in that category as of yet. The best evidence we have so far is a level 2A level of evidence, and that's 18 studies, 33% of the entire number of studies that we actually submitted. I know you don't necessarily want to know these details, you want to know what you should actually be doing, right? So, let me introduce one thing to you, and I'll show this video quickly.
Steve Berman has had better days. Just kind of slow. He didn't get a good night's sleep and feels stiff and a little nauseous, all part of living with Parkinson's disease.
It manifested itself by showing a tremor on the right side.
Parkinson's is a degenerative brain disorder that most people associate with tremors. Prescription pills help provide some symptom relief for Steve. But clinical prescriptions are adding titles to the pills. More specifically, they want to know if they can treat Steve's symptoms by forcing him to keep a fast pace on a tandem bike.
So we're probably here at 80 to 90 RPMs.
Dr. Roberts got this idea 4 years ago after a week-long tandem bike ride with a friend who has Parkinson's.
And she said, wow, for this week it didn't feel like I had Parkinson's. And that comment really spurred me on to further study and look into this more.
In the first study of its kind, Dr. Alberts is comparing the results of 5 people with Parkinson's on a tandem bike with 5 who aren't forced to keep pace on a bike. Throughout the study, each person remains on medication.
It'd be pretty hard for me to sustain this without Inch.
Okay, so 10 minutes, a little harder, I'll get your heart rate up.
Dr. Alberts says preliminary results show forced exercise improves Parkinson's symptoms up to a month afterwards. He believes this may be a result of the exercise inducing a biochemical change in the brain.
I think we're just scratching the surface here in the sense of figuring out what's going on.
I haven't had any meds yet today, and I was shaking pretty good. But this exercise, it's amazing.
And Steve hopes
Alrighty, woohoo!
it'll help him and thousands like him have better days living with this disease. Mike Jacobson reporting.
Okay, so you get the idea here. This is what we call forced exercise. It's high intensity. You've got a well-trained athlete on the front of the cycle, and the Parkinson's patient on the back is essentially being forced to move at the same speed. So they're not necessarily actively moving those legs, but they are moving their legs at the same speed. And Jay Alberts at the Cleveland Clinic would say that there's something key to this frequency of movement, that you have to be moving 80 to 90 cycles per minute or beats per minute, because that is something faster than the normal Parkinson's brain would allow you to move your legs. If we go further into the research on this, what you discover is that they've now started looking into the mechanisms of this, and it actually matches up with the research that I showed you in the beginning. The idea that perhaps we can increase the sensory drive from the legs, the proprioceptive signal back up to the brain, and therefore get some sort of improvements. What's important about this type of study is that you end up with symptom improvements. 30% improvement is a pretty significant improvement, and that symptom improvement seems to last even 2 weeks after having stopped the exercise program altogether. So that's one example, but what I've done trying to deal with, and I know this is busy, but I'm going to see if we can try and just let you look at the numbers yourself. What I've got here is our international task force asked me to try and address specific therapies that have popped into the media as of recent and basically look at what evidence is there as to whether or not you should do them. So there's the big therapy program that's out of Arizona and also Germany, sensory attention focused exercise and other sensory modalities. Tandem cycling would be that forced exercise that you just saw in the video. Tai Chi, boxing, ballet, and aerobic or water exercises. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically this first column tells you how many studies have actually been done in each of these types of therapies, so you can see the number of studies. Clearly, Tai Chi has been focused on the most. The number of participants is also important for us from a approval point of view, because we need to figure out, has there been enough people that have received this therapy to make sure that there's actual benefits? And also, has it led to any adverse events in those people that have received the therapy? And so you can see these numbers as well. You can see Tai Chi has had quite a significant number of people, so has our PD SafeX program and the sensory therapies. And the big therapy program out of Europe also has drawn a lot of attention. Here in this third column, you can see the number of weeks. 4 times per week for 4 weeks is basically what this means up here. That's how long that program runs. The PD SafeX program, which stands for Sensory Attention Focused Exercise, is 12 or 24 weeks. Tandem cycling is usually a 10-week program where you're working out 3 times per week, and you can see the differences here. Tai Chi is an interesting one because it's been evaluated by a number of different groups, and you can see 8, 12, 16, up to 24 weeks. And then here's where things get important. When we start to look at the level of evidence, which things are hitting that silver 2A level, that's the highest level that we have so far in terms of evidence. And so you can see some of the things have hit that silver 2A level. Some are hitting just close to it, silver 2B. And then if we look for other improvements, we could look at things like anxiety, depression, social outcomes, the fact that you're getting outside more, which is important to all of us, right? If we stay in our homes, remember I said that physical inactivity can lead to lots of other consequences. So we got to make sure that we're staying physically active. And so this column here is basically looking at whether or not there were improvements in these types of things like anxiety, depression, and socialization. NA basically means that it wasn't measured, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work, okay? If we look at significant outcomes is something other than movement symptoms per se, the motor symptoms that we typically evaluate in Parkinson's. And this list would tell you what things have been identified in the big therapy program, for example, that haven't been improved. So cognition, bed mobility, getting out of bed, balance, activities of daily living. And if you look across the board here, you can basically see different things like quality of life, activities of daily living again. Some people evaluate upper limb function. The tandem cycling, they also focus on heart rate and cardiovascular improvements. And you can look down the list here and see if any changes have been reported in any of these studies. And then what we tend to focus on, and this is a personal bias, but an important one I think, is motor symptom improvement. When we approve drugs for Parkinson's, we focus on the fact that the UPDRS score, the symptom severity, should improve with the type of exercise that you're doing. And what we're looking at here is basically a statistically significant yes or no, did the symptoms improve with the type of therapy? Now, just because it says no in this column and you didn't get symptom improvement, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing for you to do, because you do have these other outcomes that could have improved in those studies. So keep that in mind. The other thing that we evaluate is washout, or whether the effects of the exercise were retained, meaning if you stopped the exercise 4 weeks later or a month later or 2 months later or 6 months later, will you still have those same improvements? So in some cases it hasn't been evaluated. In other cases there's a yes, and in other cases it's a no. For the most part, it seems like it just hasn't been evaluated as of yet. So there's lots of work to do in the research world. I can see Rose is waving her hand at me at the back. She's a great conference organizer, and she's keeping everyone on time, so I'll try and hurry up. I'll just point out this last column, and we saw a video earlier as well. We've been trying to ask this question for ourselves. Why are certain things grabbing a lot of attention? And sometimes it could be to do with media, and you need to sort of keep this in the back of your mind. You know, when you see something on the news, and basically what we've got rated here, there's my cursor, is how much attention, low, medium, or high, a program has received in newscasts, magazines, and things like that. What we have to keep in mind, or I have to keep in mind as a scientist, and you as an advocate for your own symptoms, is that sometimes media attention doesn't necessarily mean it's the best activity. In other cases, maybe it's in the news for a specific reason. So we always have to think about whether or not the scientific evidence and the media attention that something is getting is worth you participating in. Okay. One very last thing I'm going to talk about is this idea, and the one category that wasn't in that previous slide was strength training. And I will point out that strength training has gained a lot of attention in the last little while. There's been some award-winning studies coming out of Chicago that have shown that strength training does significantly improve the symptoms of Parkinson's, and there is a washout effect that they don't lose that effect after several weeks of not doing the training. What we did here, this is a study from a few years ago, was we did basically what we call a head-to-head comparison. This is not an ideal study, as a researcher would say, but for all of you who want the answers, if we deliver an aquatic or water-based program, the PD SafeX program, a strength training program, an aerobic program, and control group basically means socializing but not actually doing any physical activity. What we're trying to look at here is symptom improvement. So if we're going up this axis, the higher you are up on this, in this area, the more symptom improvement you had after 12 weeks of receiving exercise, okay? On the negative side here, going downwards, you can see the control group. So socialization alone ends up leading you to the regular progression of your disease. So it's not worsening of symptoms necessarily, but it's the normal progression that you would expect to see if you weren't doing anything. What I guess is most important is that when we compare to the normal not doing anything, there were only 2 programs that stand out as statistically significant improvements in symptoms. One, again, is the strength training program, and the other one would be the PD SafeX program that we developed here based on our basic science research that led us in this direction of focusing on sensory and attention. So strength training and PD SafeX seem to be things that are very logical for people to do. One very last slide, and I use this one sometimes as a joke, but it's also important to think about when we hear people talking about programs. We often ask patients, because our measurements on a measurement scale is what we evaluate, but sometimes people say, well, who cares what you think, Quincy? Why don't you ask the patients if they actually feel better? So we did. And if we ask people on a rating scale, and what this is supposed to show is how they felt before in the light blue, and the purple is how they felt after the exercise. Here's the PD SafeX program, here's the pool program, here's the strength training program, and here's the aerobic program. The biggest difference between the blue and the purple is right here, okay? From there to there is one huge improvement. Same with the pool program. I will point out that the controls were not doing anything, and in fact their symptoms progressed as normal, but their self-report says the exact opposite. They actually felt like they got better somehow over time. Same thing with the pool program here. Maybe people like to feel like they're doing something very unusual compared to their normal routine. And so these people that were in the pool ended up reporting that exercise made them feel much better after 12 weeks. What to take out of that, I'm not sure. I guess don't trust your patients. Just joking. Okay. In summary, sensory attention-focused exercise is probably a good idea. So is strength training. The forced exercise that I showed you is gaining huge popularity in the States. I will tell you that there's a very large NIH trial that's being funded right now on the forced exercise with the tandem bikes. And when we have all of this evidence, hopefully I'll be able to come back and report to you that many of these things have the stamp of approval. At the same time, I do want to point out this principle of specificity, the idea that if you're weak, strength training definitely makes sense. If you have cardiovascular issues, we've shown in Parkinson's that you can gain that some cardiovascular function back through aerobic exercise. So really, we have to try and tailor the programs to your individual needs. Basically, my take-home message is we need to continue to find ways to keep the brain active. All right. Very, very last slide is future directions. This is the thing that we've been working on right now. This model of overload that we've been talking about, we just recently got funding from the Canadian Institute of Health Research to look very specifically at freezing of gait. And this is the first treatment study that we actually have that's trying to attempt 3 different arms of treatment on patients that suffer from freezing. So we're very proud and happy that we can actually deliver this treatment. Assessments of these patients, if you happen to be suffering from this symptom, you can feel free to email us or call. There is assessments going on right now for this study, and the treatments actually start in January. So we're very excited about these results that will come to you shortly. And I will skip over this slide and stop there. There's my team and the funding sources for this research. Thank you very much.